Right. So what does it look like then?
Yeah.
Are we going to have a roving band of tractor repair technician guerrillas? Like, hey, fellow comrade, let us jailbreak your John Deere for you,
Yeah. Hello.
Hey,
Welcome to Left Unread. My name is Aaron.
I'm Will.
We are two dudes engaged in a radical self-education.
That's right. We're simply the left arm and the right leg of the Voltron worker.
Fuck yeah. And this go-round, we are reading Che Guevara's Guerrilla Warfare. Our reading we have read.
Yes, we have read. Born in 1928 in Rosario, Argentina, Ernesto Guevara grew far from the t-shirt caricature he became known for. Brought up in a left-sympathetic family, he studied to become a doctor of leprosy. Notably, he traveled throughout South America on motorbike before eventually landing in Guatemala, only to see the effects of U.S. imperialism and intervention up close. After joining with Fidel Castro to spark the Cuban Revolution with a group of just 12 men, Che served Cuba in domestic and foreign positions alike, lending his own brand of radical Marxism to struggles throughout South America and Africa. Yeah, he was a fighter till the very end because in 1967, he took his movement to Bolivia, where he was captured and then killed.
Yep.
But he left behind a legacy of revolution, guerrilla struggle, and an interesting body of work that we read part of today.
Have you ever read the Motorcycle Diaries?
I read the Motorcycle Diaries themselves just this year, actually, and they were really good. It was nice to hear his young thoughts.
Yeah.
And you can see, I know that it was like compiled later, so probably a propagandistic kind of current in there or something, but it was really nice to see like the seeds of his ideas being planted, he was influenced by Perón in Argentina. He had this kind of Pan-American ideal. He came to see not separate countries in South America, but one people.
Yeah.
And I think that that's really important as a part of his, overall ideology later on.
For sure.
And it was also very funny. He's a charming guy. He spends a lot of the time in the book talking about just like the different people he encounters. And there's some really funny scenes in there. Like there's one where a family lets them stay overnight, and on the walk up to the mountain, they chewed coca leaves the entire time. I think they were in Peru. Maybe it was Colombia. I can't remember, but in one of those countries. And that night, he had terrible bubble gut all night because he was chewing coca leaves all day. And he stuck his ass out of the window to shit and just shat everywhere. And in the morning, when the sun was up, he goes outside and sees a tin sheet that they've been drying peaches on, and he has shit all over it. And it's like, there's like, we left immediately.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. It's very fun. There's two other diaries from him as well. There's one covering his travels in Central America as well. And then there's one where he's in Africa. That one is after the Cuban Revolution. And I am interested in reading both. If you can snatch all three in a collection, I'd recommend it. They're pretty good.
Yeah, I've never read it, never seen the film. I've also never seen the Soderbergh two-parter with Benicio del Toro. I don't know how sympathetic things like that are really going to be.
Yeah, that's always my problem. I don't need something that's ideologically rigid for me to enjoy, but I'm dubious of a lot of that media, and I don't know any better. Maybe those depictions are sympathetic, but
yeah, I don't either. I don't know.
Yeah, people are willing to say straight to your face that like Che Guevara was ontologically evil, and it's like, you clearly don't know a single thing about this man.
Yeah.
Stop watching Fox News.
Yeah, Cuba is probably second only to Stalin's USSR in its propagandization.
Which honestly is crazy to me. For this, I listened to season 2 of Blowback again, which is about Cuba. It's really about like the US's actions against Cuba, and like, man, we fucking tortured that country. We tortured that country. To think that they have come out as they are now is like genuinely impressive.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I had a family friend who went to Cuba recently. I don't know for what reason. And she was like, it's so poor there. And I'm like, yeah, it's been 60 years of, complete blockade. Yeah. Do you ever see Car Talk with Click and Clack, the Tappert Brothers?
See it? I used to listen to it all the time.
Sorry, forgive me. There's a great couple of clips on YouTube where he's in Havana, and he goes to the car shops there just to see like how they're able to maintain cars.
Yeah.
They're doing all sorts of crazy stuff. They're like,
because they can't get any of the parts.
Yeah, exactly. Like there was one, I can't remember what part it was, but something to do with the transmission. They had these old parts, and they were like, these came from Russia. They used to come from the Soviet Union, but we haven't gotten any since. So they just ended up bypassing it completely with like, a couple of bits of metal. And it's like, this is crazy.
Wow.
And the mechanic is like, I've done this procedure on like thousands of cars at this point, and I've never had a failure on it because we've just had to figure out what works the best.
Yeah. That's
So,
wild.
yeah. I'm always impressed by Cuba. It doesn't need to be said, but like their medical capacity is incredible. They have a vaccine for lung cancer. What's up with that? They developed a COVID vaccine completely on their own. It's impossible to deny.
Isn't it more doctors per capita than any other
I
country?
think that might be the case, yeah.
Yeah.
But they pay all their doctors like they pay their taxi drivers. Whoa.
Sure.
Yeah, Cuba was a great example when I was in college for economics because they were like, this is one of the dangers of 100% employment if every single person's employed. And I was just like, okay, no, all right, whatever. I don't care about this.
Yeah. Che Guevara. I was going to say, talking about him being killed in Bolivia, he even says in the book, we will be free or we will be martyrs.
Yeah, exactly.
It's one or the other.
I mean, no joke. He was there till the very end. He believed in his own theory.
For sure. And Guerrilla Warfare, originally published in 1961, Che Guevara's Guerrilla Warfare is, for all intents and purposes, a field guide for enacting the eponymous guerrilla warfare, using the success of the 1959 Cuban Revolution as a blueprint. Covering everything from how to make a Molotov cocktail to why good shoes are the best friend of the guerrilla, Guevara's text originally included an epilogue detailing the post-revolution situation in Cuba, with subsequent editions also adding amendments with case studies, examining guerrilla movements globally. 2 parts manual, 1 part reminiscence, 1 part reflection of the genuine populist politics of its charismatic author. Guerrilla warfare has stood the test of time as a tried-and-true guide for all people seeking to claim agency over their own liberation.
Yeah, just for context, we're reading from the 3rd edition. This is from SR Books. Yeah, with revised and updated introduction and case studies by Levman and Davies. And honestly, I would recommend getting a version like this. I'm sure we'll talk about this later when it comes to the why, but I don't know how well this essay really stands on its own. I think that the context of history and the context around it, even the updated essays that are included here, I mean, the edition we read followed Guerrilla Warfare, the original essay, with Guerrilla Warfare, a Method from 1963, and then also a Message to the Tricontinental in 1967. And I found both of those to be well worth reading just to kind of give it an extra stamp of context, as well as the case studies, because I'm sure I will talk about this throughout the episode, but I think guerrilla warfare has been tried. I think guerrilla warfare, as Che describes it, has definitely been tried, especially in South America and in Latin America.
Yeah, I'm interested in the future doing more reading to ideologically separate guerrilla warfare from protracted People's War.
Yeah.
And I think that we will certainly go down that road on this show in our reading. But I also, something that always sticks with me when we're reading stuff like this, and even reading stuff outside of the show about the Bolshevik Revolution, is like the applicability of things like that in the modern age.
Yeah.
And I think so much of the way Che describes guerrilla warfare in this book, I don't know how successful movements like that would be in a surveillance state, in the mechanized fucking advanced warfare world that we live in here, where drone strikes can and will be used with impunity, and concern for civilian casualties and what they call collateral damage is becoming less and less a thing.
Well, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I too, while reading this, was kind of thinking maybe the time for guerrilla warfare has passed, or maybe the conditions for it to be successful have to be so specific that I'm not sure how much value there is in most people reading this text.
Well, yeah, that's where I think I totally agree, especially when it comes to the conditions. There's a quote on 126 that I thought really spelt it out, because Che is aware of this. Che Guevara is aware of this. He says, "This is not a model, but a description of one reality of how the organization worked in one country where it proved possible to achieve triumph over an army that was fairly well organized and armed." There's even another quote where he says, "I repeat once more, it is our Cuban experience which speaks through me. New experiences can vary and improve these concepts. We offer an outline, not a Bible." So to think about the applicability of this method, I don't think it's unreasonable at all to look at the applicability of this method to a place like the United States and to conclude that it's not viable. In the case studies for this, they talk about 4 criteria that Che outlines as like the most potential, the most perfect conditions for guerrilla warfare, and it is these: the national political context of a Caribbean-type dictatorship, The dictatorship is important because the legitimacy of the government has to be low in order for you to have popular support. If the people either feel they're represented by a dictator or, the dictator makes populist policies, right, develops the country, increases the standard of living, it's a lot harder to get that kind of mass support because Che Guevara talks a lot about how the basis of the army is always with the people. You have to have the mass support behind you. And, I think that that's totally critical. So, number one there is a Caribbean-type dictator, an illegitimate government, right, or a less legitimate government. Two is the suitability of the physical terrain. That one's probably the easiest. I could think of zones difficult to reach because of dense forests, steep mountains, impassable deserts, or marshes in the U.S. aplenty.
Sure.
Right? Three, the salience and political relevance of the agrarian question. That one's a little bit tricky. I think that the agrarian question is not a specific question when it comes to land reform. It's talking about what conditions need to be met for the peasantry to support, for the mass of people at the bottom of the ladder to lend their support to you. The agrarian question in Cuba was specifically geared to the kind of feudal-like relations that they had in the country. They wanted to get rid of that. And that was what they did with the agrarian reform. And then finally, revolutionary Marxist traditions and or historical guerrilla movements that contributed to a popular base for FOCOs. And FOCO theory aside, I think that the context of Marxism in the country we're talking about is really important because, there's something he says in here that is, there's no formal lines on a map that show lines of fire between a guerrilla army and an oppressing army. There is a gray zone, though. There's a no man's land, essentially, and that no man's land isn't empty. It's full of people, right? And those people can support either, except most of the time, Che Guevara says, they'll support the insurrection. And if you think about that in the context of the American system, I don't think that's the case.
Yeah.
Right? There's plenty of good old boys who would point a shotgun at you for stepping foot on their property all over this place, no matter what you have. So
yeah, no step on snack dudes.
Yeah. It's a can of worms, a basket of basket cases. Like it's an insane environment to think about, especially because he's talking about not putting down roots, like being always on the move, if
hiking 30 miles a day basically.
Yeah. There are, there's groups of people that do that, and they're called bums. They're shunned from towns and street corners everywhere, I wasn't saying that to put down homeless people or anything. I was just saying that, I don't see a group of traveling Marxist intellectuals / guerrilla fighters receiving much purchase in many places. The work that would have to be done to gain popular support would be pretty massive.
In that context, I was actually thinking a lot about George Jackson and his kind of translation of this into urban guerrilla warfare.
Yeah.
And in that case, there's both a positive and a negative with that, because I think inside a particular community, like an urban community where everyone is living on top of one another, very close-knit, the likelihood that the people of that community knowing the guerrillas is very high. And with that, the likelihood of them understanding the oppression that the guerrillas are fighting against is very high. And so the likelihood of support of that insurrectionist movement feels pretty possible to me, pretty high, pretty probable. On the same token, though, that limits the kind of nomadic nature that Che is talking about here, where effectively you're confined to that community, which makes it, in the modern age, very easy to demolish.
Yeah. A big part of the reason that he's so certain on the rural aspect of this is because there are places to hide. He talks about favorable and unfavorable terrain, and it's the fact that a rural environment is one that you can be nomadic in, right? That you can move around, you can avoid detection, you can hide. And I haven't done a lot of research on urban guerrilla movements, but it seems like that it's definitely a lot harder. We were talking earlier about the massive mechanized state that you'd have to go up against, and it's only crazier now. I saw a report the other month that said that the Wi-Fi signal coming off of your router could be utilized to track motion, and it's like, how do you fight against that kind of thing?
Yeah.
This stuff is crazy. I was laughing when Che Guevara talks about alternative methods like smoke signals and carrier pigeons, but those Stone Age tools aside, I think that there is something to be said about, modes of communication that you can actually utilize without being breached.
Yeah, I think technology in general, just writ large, is a tool of the imperialist army that cannot be used by a guerrilla army.
It seems impossible. I mean, the thing is that it's a sliding scale, right? Like, I wrote in the margins, time until tank. You know, like initially you can do a lot, you're a lot freer in your movement because you're not under the eye of the government. But as soon as that eye opens, it's cut. You know, as soon as the government decides, like, we need to use whatever forces we need to, which they've decided aplenty in the past, you know, to get rid of these leftist movements, they'll do whatever. They'll breach any law. They don't give a fuck and a half. So it's just about establishing that kind of discipline. But the thing is, it's like, how? What can you do to circumvent that kind of technological domination and still maintain effective communication and organization?
Well, I mean,
carrier pigeons?
Jay's answer might be sabotage. He does talk pretty greatly about infrastructure and sabotage as a mode of guerrilla warfare.
Well, sure, if we're talking about roads and power lines, but I'm not going to shoot a fucking missile into the sky and take out a satellite.
Yeah, that's true. What you would need to do is find a way to disrupt the flow of information that's coming from that satellite.
Right, but, I mean, what?
Yeah.
You know? My God. That's the kind of thing that makes it seem insurmountable.
Yeah.
You know? And just to talk a little bit about the case studies in the back of this book, I mean, the thing that stopped the guerrilla movements in a couple of these countries was just straight up repression. Like, that's literally it. They just made it worse and worse and worse until the guerrillas could no longer survive. You know? And then most of the time they gave them a political out that neutralized them as a threat. So, like, you know...
We're starting this episode on a real fucking downer.
I think it's just important because that's why we read it. I mean, that's why we read it, you know? It's like, does this method still have purchase today? I mean, yeah, this book is in, like, the canon of communist theory, but it's just recognizability, you know? We got the face right on the front cover.
Yeah, I mean, if I was going to zoom out and talk about my big picture takeaways, it's largely that I have the utmost respect for Che Guevara, and there are things in this book that I think are useful.
Yeah.
But certainly this isn't, like, a top 5 text for anybody.
Yeah, I think that as a study of history, I think it was nice, you know? I mean, there are theoretical things in here that are important, but they're the same theoretical things that we would read in, like, Mao.
Yeah, you get them elsewhere. I will say, on a positive note, we spent, this is what, episode 33?
33, I think.
34?
34.
We've spent 33 episodes kind of lamenting how vague a lot of the theory that we're reading is. It's like, what are the actual things that are supposed to happen? And to this book's credit, this is 100% a field guide, a manual. He tells you exactly this is what to do, down to how many fucking socks to put in your knapsack or whatever, how many miles you should be expected to be hiking every single night,
what industries to prioritize, you know? I mean, lots of things like that, you know?
How to turn a shotgun into a rocket launcher.
It was cracking me up because I was thinking about, there was a news report that when they were raiding the Columbia university encampments, they found a copy of Guerrilla Warfare in there, and it's like, why were they reading this? You know, someone probably got it and they're like, hell yeah, Che Guevara, and then they were reading it and they were like, make sure your production of cigarettes is, you know, up to par so you can keep your soldiers satisfied, right? Or women should be put into teaching roles, or, you know, shit like that. So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, it was an interesting read, but I think it's more interesting in the context of history.
I would agree with that. I will say something that he starts out with pretty quickly that I found really interesting. On 51, he mentions 3 fundamental lessons from the Cuban Revolution on how to conduct revolutionary movements in America. And number 3, I guess, is the one that stood out to me, which reads, in underdeveloped America, the countryside is the basic area for armed fighting. And I take that not just to be about the terrain, but also about the fighters. Because I think it's really interesting as an idea to suggest that what I'll call country folk are more self-reliant and therefore would make significantly better guerrilla fighters than fucking suburbanites or city folk. I think that's a really interesting idea.
Yeah. It's funny because I think it was in the Venezuelan case study, they talked about how a lot of the initial cadre were all, you know, like urban intellectuals and stuff, and they were having a really rough time, you know, believe it or not. The tropical mountains are not the nicest place to try to rough it and also gain support from the people. You know?
Well, and, you know, I was thinking about, like, exactly that, the kind of intellectual cadre of Marxists that come to my mind when I think about the intelligentsia or whatever of Marxists are people like, you know, people from the Frankfurt School, or like people in France like Sartre and de Beauvoir. And it's like, Imagine Sartre on the front lines, man.
I'm thinking about Theodore Adorno trudging through the Everglades carrying an M16.
It's like fucking useless. And they have a place for sure. But like to pretend as though they're going to be the front line of some sort of guerrilla army is insane.
Yeah. Well, I think that there's a tempering effect of reading this, and it's, you really have to reckon with your own body, right? Like, could I do this? Fuck no.
Fuck no.
Fuck no. I'm a pudgy man. Like, it's not going to happen. But, you really have to grapple with what this kind of conflict means. I mean, this is war, is what Che Guevara is talking about. And it's not that it's war for war's sake. I mean, it's war because the peace has already been broken, as he says. It's war because it's the last option available, right? But it is war at the end of the day, And it's like, I hate, there's like a dumb meme that's like, every one front line has 10 support people. You could be the supply guy or the propagandist or this and that. And it's like, who's fighting? Who's doing the fighting?
Someone has to be on the front.
Someone's doing the fighting. And that's the kind of thing, because he talks about, I mean, God, like the revolutionary has to be ready to give up their life. They have to be ready to give up their family, their kids, their significant others, like all sorts of things.
Yeah.
And it's like, you can't ask everybody to do that, I mean, you can ask, but I don't know if you'll get that many answers. There has to be a real ideological conditioning. And when it comes down to the fact that the base of your support is from normal people, right?
Yeah.
Normal, disillusioned people, that makes that really difficult. He does talk about re-education or education or, indoctrination or whatever in here, but it's tough. And I also don't know how well that was reflected in the real life movements that tried to follow this Foucault theory. It seemed that often a lot of the militias would take anybody they could. And I mean, that's totally reasonable. But
out of necessity.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in a lot of these countries, there were other coups that were attempted in the meantime, and like those people that attempted the coups were ousted, right? Or they went into exile or they fled, and a lot of times they'd be recruited, you know what I mean? And so, especially in the context of maybe liberation struggles in South America, it's a much more diverse blend of people than the ideal might be. If you read this and are imagining like a completely lockstep cadre of guerrillas, like, yeah, I think that would be ideal, but in practice, it's simply not what happens. So I don't know. It's like the big tent party problem. You have to be as massive of a group as you can, but the more people you bring in, the more differentiated everyone's ideas will be. And I'm sure that there are ways to get around that. I mean, whatever, democratic centralism. But it's just a real challenge, especially if putting it back into the applicability of this, I gotta convince Americans to become communists. Like, is that it, And again, I think that people are much more amenable to socialist policy than anyone gives them credit for, even themselves. But it's still a struggle.
Yeah, even just winning the ideological war, not even quite literally the real war.
Actual war.
Yeah, but just getting people to recognize that they believe in a lot of things that they've been that have been demonized and propagandized to the point that they think they don't believe it is a war in and of itself.
Yeah.
To that point, though, on page 101, Che does outline the development of a guerrilla band. He does kind of describe how that needs to happen. He writes, at the outset, there is more or less a homogeneous group with some arms that devotes itself almost exclusively to hiding in the wildest and most inaccessible places, making little contact with the peasants. It strikes a fortunate blow, and its fame grows. A few peasants, dispossessed of their land or engaged in a struggle to conserve it, and young idealists of other classes join the nucleus. It acquires greater audacity and starts to operate in inhabited places, making more contact with the people of the zone. It repeats attacks, always fleeing after making them. Suddenly it engages in combat with some column or other and destroys its vanguard. Men continue to join it. It has increased in number, but its organization remains exactly the same. Its caution diminishes, and it ventures into more populous zones. Mm-hmm. And so he's kind of describing here what they did in Cuba. Like you said, it was Che, Castro, and
10 guys.
10 other dudes.
Yeah.
Did this. They started a thing that their infamy or their fame grew, and that grew with its popular support from the people.
Right.
And with that came more people joining, and with that allowed them to develop it further and further to the point that it became a thing large enough to defeat the vanguard of the other army.
Right.
And from there, it just continues to kind of blossom. Do I see that happening now?
I mean, it's just that, honestly, a quote that really puts it great is on page 159. Their only alternatives are life or death, at times when death is a concept 1,000 times present and victory only a myth for a revolutionary to dream of.
Yeah.
Every step of the way, there are just a million points of failure. And the further you get away from those prime conditions that we talked about earlier, the more apparent death is as the outcome, And I think that, that can have a totally paralyzing effect, but it's just really tricky to try to get around. God, I'm just thinking about, right, you, me, and 10 dudes. We go out to fucking Utah, and not Utah, Jesus, the Mormons would eat us alive. We're out in the desert, or the Everglades, or the Appalachians, or whatever, right? We're not putting down roots. We're still nomadic, but we're attempting to reach out to the people in this community, in this zone, and then to hear their problems out and address them in a way that garners their support for our movement. I don't even know what that looks like. Are we fucking running around and changing people's tires? That's silly, but what does that actually take? I'd be interested in maybe examples of what that looks like, even in the Cuban experience. But, what would addressing people's problems in rural America look like today? Mutual aid programs? The kinds of programs that the Black Panther Party was doing? that would make sense, but it's hard to see that directing energy into support of a militia.
Yeah, I have some kind of general responses to that. Number one, just immediately, my first thought is the Appalachian Mountains is probably the best place for something like this to begin, because there's already going to be pretty strong popular support for anti-establishment, anti-government
something
attitudes.
Else.
Yeah. And the terrain itself is what Che is describing here.
Right.
That's just a quick thought, number one. Number two is, I think perhaps part of the problem with building popular support in the United States is that the repression, even though there are very visible parts of the repression that principled communists certainly see very clearly, it's not as in one's face for a lot of the public.
Right.
You have to be kind of tapped in to recognize a lot of that repression. And the repression that you don't have to be tapped in for is so propagandized, like the violence of the police, for example.
Yeah.
So propagandized to the point that it can be written off as a non-repressive force, as a response to repression, as opposed to repression itself.
Yeah.
And so, how to win popular support in this context is tricky, for sure.
Tricky. That's what I was going to say, especially your point about the police. I'm thinking about when he talks about, on 151, he says that barefaced violation of all legislation or of laws specifically instituted to sanction ruling class deeds only increases the tension of the people's forces. Thus, the oligarchical dictatorship attempts to use the old legal order to change constitutionality and oppress the proletariat without a frontal clash, right?
Yep.
And what Che says is that we must invite that frontal clash.
Which is basically the same as what George Jackson said.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely agree. In fact, I'm looking at, on 154, the dictatorship tries to function without resorting violence. Thus, we must try to oblige the dictatorship to resort to violence, thereby unmasking its true nature as the dictatorship of the reactionary social class. And the thing is that, what does that violence look like? If it's calling in the National Guard, if it's calling in the police, if it's calling in the Marines, we've already seen that happen all day, every day.
Yep.
Just like you said, that idea is already taken over. It's already oh, okay, this is just a part of things. They're here to protect and serve and all of that. How do you make the people connect that kind of repression? How do you make them disconnect that kind of repression from what they already expect to see in everyday life? I know there's people that love the police, the thin blue line and all of that, but the people that would ostensibly support a guerrilla band, right? They're already used to seeing that kind of repression. They're already used to seeing that kind of violence on the day-to-day. So what makes the difference here? Now there's an alternative. I can go support this guerrilla band instead, and they can assassinate the chief of police or whatever. They can sabotage my power lines. There's a bit of a conflict there. I just don't know if I can see that kind of methodology working in the same way.
The sabotage point, maybe we can pivot to that, because I think that Che does kind of address that a little bit. But first, I think it's important to distinguish sabotage from terrorism,
right,
which he does talk about a little bit.
Yeah.
Let's do that. Let's see. On page 60, Che writes, acts of sabotage are very important. It is necessary to distinguish clearly between sabotage, a revolutionary and highly effective method of warfare, and terrorism, a measure that is generally ineffective and indiscriminate in its results, since it often makes victims of innocent people and destroys a large number of lives that would be valuable to the revolution.
Right. On 61, when he says, it's ridiculous to carry out sabotage against a soft drink factory, but it's correct and advisable to carry out sabotage against a power plant.
Yeah, exactly. So First, in the distinction with sabotage and terrorism, I think part of the problem is that a lot of what is in the popular consciousness is viewed as acts of terrorism. When you have a quote-unquote nonviolent protest and people are throwing bricks and doing shit like that, fine by me, but for whatever reason, the way that it gets framed in the narrative overall is that these are acts of terror or quote-unquote violent action, and therefore the kind of revolutionary potential of that action, because it was never appropriately planned and, like enacted with intention, it gets co-opted by the kind of zeitgeist into being a terrorist action, which probably hurts its popular support more than it helps it. To that end, also, I was going to try to find the quote, but Che does mention when a guerrilla band is enacting acts of sabotage, doing things like cutting power lines and stuff like that to a community, he acknowledges there is going to be a loss for people that live in that community.
Yeah, it's a paralysis of life is what he says.
Yeah, and you have to be very careful about the way that you manage that, because you're going to lose popular support when you do it.
Yeah.
And if it is not done in the right context and for the right reasons, effectively, like you're playing with fire. It's a calculus that is not always going to end up in favor of the guerrilla.
But in the modern context, I think the problem there is that context that we're talking about is so narrow. How do you hit the target correctly? I can't think of an act of sabotage that wouldn't immediately say, we're under attack by terrorists, or there's Iranian sleeper cells or whatever in our fucking communities. The power goes out in the whole city, and then your fucking political organization comes out and says, we blew up this substation for your own good. So you can see the repression of the system laid bare. I don't know how that message gets translated in the same way. I mean, I don't want to talk about treatlerites again, but people stop getting their treats and they get angry. You know what I mean? Aside from that, it's just like the cultural controls of capital right now are so strong. I don't know what would really truly be an act of sabotage in the minds of the people we're looking to entice. Mm-hmm. That's why I was thinking about assassinate the police chief or whatever. It's almost like a fucking... I can't remember the name of the movie. It's an old movie that was remade with The Rock, and he comes into town, and there's
oh yeah, fuck.
It's like Walking Hard.
Walk hard.
Walk tall.
Walk tall.
Walk Hard is
Walking
the Dewey Cox story.
I know the movie you're talking about. Fuck.
It's like cartoonish, I'm coming to liberate this town from a corrupt police department or whatever. What acts of resistance could be utilized in the modern context? I mean, I could see things like how people sabotage defense industries and things like that, like blowing up a pipeline or whatever. That makes sense, but it doesn't necessarily track in the same way. It wouldn't be paralyzing to life in the zone to do that kind of sabotage. So if we're talking about that kind of grand scale act that would do that... Walking tall. When we're talking about a grand scale act that is in line with what Jay is saying about sabotage, I don't know what act that would be that still connects to the people.
Yeah, what I'm seeing as legitimate acts of sabotage in this context, meaning useful are targeted specifically against military infrastructure. And in that case, it shouldn't have much impact on the people. Now, it will be propagandized to the point that it will likely be used as a weapon to try to turn the people against them, but it's not going to impact them in their day-to-day life in that same way.
I mean, yes and no. It depends on... I'm thinking about cities that rely on a military base, basically. 30% of the population is all people that work on the base and their spouses and shit. First off, that's a chunk of people that are going to be much harder to reach or turn or whatever.
For sure.
But secondly, it's attacking those industries or those institutions. It would still be paralyzing in the sense that now 30% of the population is on guard, is on alert.
That's true. That's a good point.
Yeah. I guess you could say that about any town that has a mono industry going on inside of it. That's kind of an old idea now. I don't know how many cities are really like that. But, if you're talking about a rural area, a lot of times those are relying on a small number of industries.
I'm going to sound like an idiot because I don't remember all of the details, but I know that there was a group of people that got busted for acts of sabotage against, I think it was a software company in the UK that they were using chips in a lot of the weapons that Israel was using, and they got busted.
Yeah.
And other than the propaganda, that would have no impact on the people in that area.
Yeah, I mean, I know what you're saying though, but is that effective for garnering additional local support? I don't know if that it's like we blew up your factory, you know.
But I mean, the people, like in that case, the people overwhelmingly are against the genocide happening in Palestine.
That's true.
And so, like, to
If
see
you can make that political connection. Then,
yeah.
Yeah.
Now, there does need to be deliberate,
Right.
a deliberate, organized act to make that connection, I think, for folks.
Yeah. It's just such a narrow target is what I'm feeling about it, you know? I can't imagine coming to the people and saying, we blew up your power lines, you're welcome, you know?
Yeah, I get that. Or it's like, yeah, we fucking blew up the municipal water supply.
By the way,
good luck.
To our FBI agents that are listening, right? We're talking about in Minecraft, first of all. You know, an act of sabotage doesn't have to be a big fucking explosion. I mean, you know, gumming up the works or whatever, putting sawdust in the tanks or whatever, sugar in someone's gas tank.
Yeah, like to talk about people's comfort and the way that we live currently, to cut off someone's access to power or water, that's going to hurt support more than it's going to help.
Well, there is a time in this where he says that the zone should never be impoverished by the actions of the revolutionary. Let me find that.
Yeah, that's the quote I was looking for earlier.
It's on 107. Keep in mind that the zone ought by no means to be impoverished by the direct action of the rebel army, even though the latter will be responsible indirectly for the impoverishment that results from enemy encirclement, a fact that the adversary's propaganda will repeatedly point out.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. I mean, maybe in terms of inviting repression, I was thinking about police violence, but it could just be institutional annoyance, you know, like endless checkpoints. You know what I mean? Like if you have to drive through a bunch of fucking security checkpoints every day, that's going to be helpful for, I mean, it'll change your attitude about the systems of repression. You know what I mean? If you're being stopped and searched because everyone's looking for an insurgent, if you're a regular person, I think that will disillusion you with the...
How much does fucking TSA annoy everybody, as an example?
You don't have to take your shoes off anymore. So.
Cool.
Yeah, honestly, there's a great Philosophy Tube video about security theater.
Yeah.
And in the video, they talk about asking a TSA agent, like, when will we be done with this? You know, when will we be done with these measures?
Yeah.
Right? 9/11 was 20 years ago. Why do we still have these ideas? You know, and there's no answer to that. You know, but like that's the kind of question that could, you know, engender support for you. It's like, why do we still have these repressive measures? You know, who's doing shoe bombs in this day and age? Why do I have to take off my fucking shoes? And also, why do they change the damn rules every time? Does the laptop come out of my bag or not? You're already blasting me with fucking super x-rays the entire time. Just give me a fucking straight direction, please.
Yeah.
Sorry. Sorry.
Someone has strong feelings about the TSA.
Listen, all right? Don't bark at me because I'm following the orders you gave me on the last trip I was here. At the same airport, mind you. At the same airport. I don't want to fucking hear it.
We're all over the place.
Yeah, I know. We're kind of just riffing on this one.
Yeah, I kind of thought that that's the way it was going to go. I have a lot of like bigger picture things.
Right.
The details are fine, but what is there to comment about what all should go in a gorilla's rucksack?
Yeah.
You know?
Especially because a lot of this is, I mean, not the rucksack stuff, you know, although you might object to SIGs being part of your essential industries. I love that, dude. It's like, what do we need right away? Shoes. Ammunition, SIGs. SIGs and cigars.
Dude loves shoes.
Yeah.
And I get it. When you're fucking hiking 30 miles a day, a good pair of shoes is very important.
If all you're going to do is hike, man, I mean, you better have some nice fucking shoes, especially if you're going to be in the Appalachians.
Yeah. And to think about one comfort that can be granted to every gorilla that they can carry with them everywhere, without which morale would drop so low. Shoes would be high on that list for sure.
Shoes for sure.
I have a complete non sequitur, a complete switch if we want to go to something else. On 111, I was really interested. I found myself going back and forth at this point in the book and then again kind of near the end around quote unquote the role of the woman.
Role of the woman. I knew this was going to come up. Yes.
Because at first I'm like, ooh, base feminism.
Awesome. And then...
Yeah, and it's like, I'm having trouble deciding where I stand on this. Because, first of all, the role of the woman, he says, in all our countries with their colonial mentality, there is a certain underestimation of the woman, which becomes a real discrimination against her. And I'm like, fuck yeah. Based. And then he's talking about how the woman is capable of performing all of these tasks, even the most difficult ones, alongside their male gorilla counterparts or whatever. And then he goes into describing what he thinks, quote unquote, the woman can do to help the gorilla. And he mentions cooking, teaching, reading, being a nurse or a doctor. Okay.
Okay.
Manufacture of uniforms. And it's like, interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting how he's saying that they're capable of doing everything, but then still relegating them to the kind of traditional gender roles of the woman.
Yeah.
Even after talking about how they can use this kind of weaponized misogynistic underestimation of the woman in favor of building support for the guerrillas, and then says, like, they can cook and teach and clean and sew uniforms.
Yeah.
And it's like,
it's just a great reminder that this was written in 1960, you know? And I think that the important thing here to me, I mean, this is a laugh to read. I could laugh all day about Che's obvious sexism here. But the thing is that middle portion is buttressed by what we had said before. And also at the end, women can take part in all lines of civil organization. They can replace men perfectly well and ought to do so, even where persons are needed for carrying weapons. Right? And he even says, you know, in the next paragraph, persons who are otherwise free and love each other should be permitted to marry, you know? So it's like a pragmatism of the era here. You know, it's like we have these women that we do consider to be revolutionaries as well. What do we do with them? Here's all our gender stereotypes, right?
Yeah.
But, again, I think that it's important to look at the role of women in the Cuban Revolution. I mean, they were an astronomically important part of it. You know, whether it was in the urban revolutionary operations, women played a huge part of that. As Che says in here, you know, they transported goods, they did messages, they did spycraft. I mean...
And with good reason, because they were, he says, less likely to be suspect of being a part of this guerrilla band, and therefore it was much easier for them to move across enemy lines, I guess.
So I think that, you know, even though there's obviously sexism seeping in here, I think that on its foundational ideals, I mean, Che is talking about equality. He is talking about women can do what men can do, and they should.
Yeah.
It's just that,
And your point about the marriage, the line that he gives there about how persons who are otherwise free, who love each other, should be permitted to marry. I was thinking about that in context, and then later on 129, he kind of brings up something again, and I don't know the historical context here, but I'm getting the impression that he's writing from a position where discipline requiring celibacy was something that he was kind of pushing against, because this idea that, like, if it doesn't get in the way of what we're doing, people should be able to do whatever they want. They can have romantic relationships. There's no big deal.
You know, it's a private matter. But he even says on that section before about women, on 111, you know, he says, despite the current belief, she does not create conflicts of a sexual type in the troops. So it's like he's totally an acknowledgement that that's a ridiculous notion.
Yeah.
I think that it's part of that, but continue, please.
Well, I was going to bring up on 129, he brings up, quote, a weakness for women. The weakness for women that young men have when living apart from their habitual medium of life in special, even psychic conditions is well known. As dictators are well aware of this weakness, they try to use it for infiltrating their spies. At times, the relationship of these women with their superiors is clear and even notorious. At other times, it is extremely difficult to discover even the slightest evidence of contact. Therefore, it is necessary also to prohibit relations with women. In that context where he's talking about prohibiting relations, is he talking about from the perspective of a dictator, or is he saying for the guerrillas?
Well, wait a minute.
Because I was getting lost in it a little bit there. Because it's contradicting what he said earlier, you know, if that's the case.
I think he's talking about from the context of the revolutionary. Yeah.
So it just feels a little, I was like, which way is it?
I don't know. I mean, that is tough. In the next line, when he says the revolutionary in a clandestine situation preparing war should be a complete aesthetic, I think it's just part of that idea of, like, the things you have to give up to be a revolutionary.
Yeah.
You know, and part of that is, like, I'm not fucking around. Like, I can't be, you know, chasing women as I'm trying to do my clandestine guerrilla operations, as I'm traveling from mountain peak to cave and trying to garner my support and sabotaging industrial lines and roads and shit. It's like, what are you really worried about here? Is it the revolution or not?
Well, and the point there is effectively that you have to be suspicious of everyone that's trying to get in close to you, and that is a way that is quite evident that it would be possible to be put in a compromising situation. He even says right above that no one should be permitted to live alone or go out, nor go out alone, to the point that, like, we have to be suspicious of everyone and hold ourselves to a standard of accountability with one another, to the point that you can't even fucking go somewhere by yourself because who knows what's going on.
I mean, God, just thinking about the actual experience of a lot of these, not necessarily just guerrilla groups, but even just like leftist organizations, is that they were, you know, rife with infiltration.
Oh, yeah. That's where it's like every time we get to talking about repression, I'm like, there kind of has to be some, though.
Yeah, exactly. It's like...
Because like Stalin saying being put between two fires, that's exactly what it's like.
Right.
You know the enemy you're fighting against that's in front of you.
Yeah.
And you also should know that they are working very much to infiltrate the people behind
Yeah.
you.
God, man. Stop making me agree with Stalin. Fuck. I guess it's just like, to what extent can an undercover cop really go? You know what I mean? Like, if you're talking about at the smallest level, right? If you have a cadre of 12 people under one super commandante or whatever, whatever you want to call it. Just to interrupt myself, I love when he says that, the leader of a small group can call himself whatever he wants, because at the end of the day, he only leads a small army.
Yeah.
But it's like the kind of things you're doing in that environment. Is an undercover cop going to do a sabotage operation with you? Like, is an undercover cop going to do an assassination with you?
They're not going to do it. They're going to plan it with you and then catch you in the act.
Yeah, exactly.
That's exactly what happened with the Earth Liberation Front. I mean, I've talked about this a couple of times on the show, but like, there are very clear stories of where cops infiltrated these groups, helped them plan their actions, and then on the night of the action, fucking caught them, set them up.
It's just the fucking murder of Fred Hampton again, man.
Yep.
That's so fucked.
And I mean, it's not even in the case of Fred Hampton too. It's not even just undercover cops. William O'Neill was an informant.
Yeah.
He was a CI.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah, I didn't even think about that. Just a regular guy, who had been leveraged against because of his fucking past crimes and stuff, man.
Yep.
That sucks. Yeah, highly recommend. There is a documentary produced by a Black Panther adjacent group called The Murder of Fred Hampton, which is very good. And also, if you haven't seen it, Judas and the Black Messiah is fucking incredible.
Fucking great.
Yeah, so infiltration is on the mind a lot, obviously.
Yeah.
There's an interesting question about agrarian reform here, and it is the agrarian question. What is the agrarian question of the day? First off, I love that's a great convention, by the way. The blank question.
Yeah.
I'm quite enamored by that. But the question that I have is, what is the agrarian question of the day? What does modern land reform look like? And I don't mean land reform as necessarily the redistribution of land, although that might be included. What is the land reform of the modern era? The first thing my mind jumps to is something like UBI. Not like, the government cuts you a check, but just like literally taking care of people's needs in a way that, I don't know, liberates them from oppression. Like, the structure that the guerrillas are saying, they're saying, support us, we'll do land reform. That addresses your direct need for land to work, for, personal production, and it also eliminates the feudal systems of oppression that were still present in these environments, right? What kind of question is in the modern day that addresses those same kinds of concerns in a modern parallel?
I mean, that really feels like you're asking who is the modern feudal lord. I mean, because Cuba, that's effectively what they were doing with their land reform. It was like taking back land from the feudal lords under Batista and redistributing it. So the people that were already working that land now had an ownership stake in it. That's a pretty clear thing there in Cuba.
Sure.
Who is the modern day feudal lord? Who is the feudal lord here? I mean, fucking BlackRock.
But who is the feudal lord here is a great question, right? That's the thing. Like, you wouldn't go out to a bunch of farmers and say, support us and we'll give you your own land.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Ostensibly, they have their... I'm assuming that
that land is often owned privately, even though the crop that they're growing on it is heavily subsidized, probably. And that would be a significant hurdle to jump to win popular support.
Right. So what does it look like then? Are we going to have a roving band of tractor repair technician guerrillas? Like, hey, fellow comrade, let us jailbreak your John Deere for you, Like, I mean, that's a serious question, though, because if you're going to say, here's the things that we want to institute that will make your lives better materially, what does that look like in the modern day, aside from just like, I don't know, a cash injection or something? I mean, it would be things like, like we mentioned earlier with the Black Panthers, child services, transportation services.
Yeah, meet a need that you see in the community.
Right.
The real answer to your question is to ask them. Ask the farmers.
Yeah. Yeah. They're fucking John Deere's, man, Hey, I've come with my Guerrilla brand of corn seeds that has, no Monsanto trademark on it or whatever. Like, that seems wild, The agrarian question is so simple. We take the land from the latifundia and then we give it to you. That's it. Like, oh, awesome. I don't know. It's just a trickier thing. I mean, you can see the way... I think that, like, the private land and the non-private seeds is a great example because it's, in a sense, the way that the systems of control have shifted away from land reform being an obvious answer. And I don't mean that that's an intentional thing, but in a way it kind of is. This system of oppression isn't reliant on ownership of the land necessarily, because instead they just own the seeds and every product you have to buy to live.
Not to further complicate things, but this is a question that is always on my mind whenever I'm thinking about land back.
Oh, yeah.
Here on fucking Turtle Island,
Right.
where all of the land is stolen to quote-unquote redistribute the land, how are we considering indigenous peoples in the land that the land that was theirs to begin with are stealing it and then redistributing it amongst ourselves is still theft?
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. I was thinking about land back recently because I saw an interview on TikTok where someone said that, America is incompatible with land back.
Yeah.
And, I mean, that's just an obvious truth.
I think I might have reposted that.
I think you might have. Yeah, I think you did, actually.
Yeah.
Nice. And I think that that's such a sincere question. Part of me thinks about in the discussion around black skin, white masks, where it says that this kind of racial insanity can only be solved by mutual recognition. There's part of me that feels that way about land back. What's the best way to address land back? Well, it's to go to the people and say, what would be best?
What's the best way?
Yeah, exactly. At the same time, though, I mean, there's an imbalance in that conversation, and it's the fact that there's 1% of 1% of the population still alive, you know? Even if we give all of them land and say, we did it, that's not a solution. I mean,
the real injustice is that it's built on the back of a genocide. Yeah.
The harm has already been done, How do you rectify that in the same way? I don't know. I mean, I'm not the person to answer that question.
Yeah.
That's for somebody indigenous.
And I suppose I shouldn't say the real injustice. Maybe that's the wrong way to put it, but...
Well, it's just that the damage has been done.
Yeah.
The damage has been done.
It's an inequity that can't be rectified.
Yeah. I always think of in Watchmen, the new Watchmen show, where they have, like, the reparations center, They have, like, the come get your DNA scan and then determine. It's like, what...
President Robert Redford.
What kind of system would... Like, is that what we're talking about? I mean, that kind of thing seems a lot more equitable than just saying, like, here's some land, da-da-da. But I don't know what it entails. If you're an indigenous person, if you're a Native American, let us know. If you have some ideas about land back, let us know. leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com.
Yeah, we would love to hear it and get recommendations on good text.
Yes, absolutely. That's something to be said as well about guerrilla warfare. That's a person I'm actually interested in reading something by, is Maria Tegui. I'm looking on page maybe 272. This might be in the case studies. Jose Carlos Maria Tegui. Antedating Che Guevara's emphasis on the agrarian question as a key to social change, Maria Tegui sought to formulate an indigenous brand of socialism based on ancient pre-Columbian Indian communal land tenure system, the Ailu. Regardless, it's like the indigenous question is a serious question as well. I mean, obviously more so in South America, but also in America.
For sure.
Where does that stand? That guy was really influential on Che's thinking, and also many, many leftists in South America. But it's just part of the question,
It's an interesting question and certainly an important one to consider in the larger conversation around land reform.
Yeah, so that's really my question there, the land reform question. What's the land reform question?
The agrarian land reform question.
Right. It's my indigenous agrarian land reform question. America's fucked, y'all. There is part of that that's like, what's the core contradiction? What's the central contradiction in America? Mm-hmm. I've heard many answers to that question, none of which are completely satisfying. So, what's the central question?
My goodness. This is going to become a motif on the show, too. I know it.
Well, it's already a fucking motif because every time they talk about something, it's the blank question, the national question, the Polish question, the fucking, any of those, the indigenous question, the agrarian question. There's always a question.
Yeah.
Shall we cavalcade here?
Yeah, let's go to the cavalcade, shall we? There are quite a few.
Thanks for sticking with us. I mentioned this one earlier, but right on 51, when the forces of oppression come to maintain themselves in power against established law, peace is already considered broken. The guerrilla outbreak cannot be promoted since the possibilities of peaceful struggle have not been exhausted. So when we're talking about guerrilla warfare, we're saying that we're beyond peace. Likewise, he quotes Marti on 152, which I know I just went from the front of the book to the back of the book. But I love this quote. He who wages war in a country when he can avoid it is a criminal, just as he who fails to promote war when it cannot be avoided is criminal. You know, that really spoke to me.
That's dope. That's a good one.
Yeah. I will say that he does talk about the guerrilla struggle as a means to an end. The final triumph will come from a regular army. I know we didn't talk about the organizational structure, but it's a pretty basic military structure, and I think groups of 10 to 15 men, he says, and then it will transition to a modern army to win a modern war, as he says.
Just a great turn of phrase. I don't have a lot of comment on it, but on 72, to the stoicism imposed by the difficult conditions of warfare should be added an austerity born of rigid self-control that will prevent a single excess, a single slip, whatever the circumstances. The guerrilla soldier should be an aesthetic.
Yeah.
And then I have another on 75. A wounded enemy should be treated with care and respect unless his former life has made him liable to a death penalty, in which case he will be treated in accordance with his deserts.
Yeah.
I just liked that.
Yeah, set free after receiving a lecture was very
receiving
funny.
a lecture.
Dude, just imagine being a soldier. You're a cop, right? And you're doing your beat, and then a bunch of guerrillas kidnap you, or like you report to a call and you get knocked out, and you wake up and there's just a bunch of people talking about Marxism, Leninism, and they're like, all right, you're good to go.
Yeah.
What happened there?
Consider this your re-education.
Yeah.
On 81, sugar is another essential part of the supplies, as is salt, without which life becomes sheer martyrdom, and something that serves to season the meals such as onion, garlic, etc., according to the characteristics of the country.
Yeah, sorry, Che. I thought we were aesthetics here. Like, what are we talking about?
You gotta have salt.
You can't make it without salt. On 73, this one just kind of gave me a bit of pause. The guerrilla fighter will be a sort of guiding angel who has fallen into the zone, helping the poor always, and bothering the rich as little as possible in the first phases of the war. But this war will continue on its course. Contradictions will continuously become sharper, and the moment will arrive when many of those who regarded the revolution with a certain sympathy at the outset will place themselves in a position diametrically opposed, and they will take the first step into battle against the popular forces. I don't know, I was thinking about, what do, right? Do you just walk into somebody's fucking yard?
Emerge from the reeds.
Yeah, you know, hey, me and my buddies have been hiking out there in the Appalachians. You got any problems? Like, it seems crazy.
We come to serve.
Yeah. What can we do? You're going to end up working their fucking fields, man. Like, I'm looking at 77 where he says the social composition should be adjusted to the zone. You know, even if we're critical of guerrilla warfare as a method, there's still something to be said about the context in which it's given, right? Like we said earlier, it's not a Bible. It's just an option. Even if I earnestly think that guerrilla warfare has mostly been supplanted by protracted People's War or People's War in general at this point, it's still talking about what was successful as a condition in Cuba, what was successful as a means of struggle in a lot of Latin America, even if it ultimately didn't succeed. Just thinking about, like, what methods are appropriate to what time and what place. Mm-hmm. Maybe there will be a context in which guerrilla warfare is useful. I mean, honestly, this is without knowing anything about protracted People's War, but, you know, as I talked about on 2 episodes ago, I think, when we talked about Stalin, a party having to be compartmentalized in order to avoid destruction by this huge technological force, maybe that does look more like Foucault theory than, you know, like a large guerrilla organization. I might be wrong about that. You know, we haven't read anything about People's War yet, but I could see it. Do I think it would work right now if I took my 10 buddies and we hiked it out to upstate New York or something? No. But given the right context, you know, when the empire dissolves and we live in the super state of J.B. Pritzker's Mega Ohio, then we can do our small focused bands of guerrillas, maybe.
Fair enough.
Something interesting on 84, kind of like how Chase says that the leader can call himself whatever he wants. I thought it was interesting that in the Cuban War, grades of corporal and sergeant were omitted because they were considered reminiscent of tyranny. You know, that's why they were all under commandantes. You know, I thought that was really neat.
Yeah, I marked that as well. Reminiscent of the tyranny, I thought was interesting.
Yeah. He even says in the end that he says that they ran into the, I don't know where I put the quote, but he says that they ran into the issue of trying to put the new revolutionary mind into the old bottles of military, you know, and like that was a mistake that they had made initially. So there is like this developing practice. As a matter of fact, there's one thing I missed where He says that in the Cuban experience, the leaders taught the people about what it means to wage war, and the people also taught the leaders about what the people need. So there is that kind of back and forth, like almost like the mass line, you know? It's just important to remember that, like, the basis of your support comes from the people, ultimately. It should be made of the people as well. So,
Absolutely.
yeah. If you have this book, go to page 88 and look at the diagram of the Molotov launching shotgun. Don't know how applicable that is, but how cool is that? Just fire a blank with a piece of wood stuck in it and launch a Molotov?
Dude, the whole description of that, I was like, how are they not terrified this is going to blow up in their hands?
I mean, it's nothing crazy. I don't know, but it's just about creative thinking and stuff like that.
Yeah, for sure. It's an invention of necessity.
Yeah. There's plenty of tools at our disposal, which I think are really interesting. And, we were talking about the technological giant that you'd be up against in a modern day guerrilla war, but, like, it just means that there are more interesting solutions. Like, have you ever seen the Flipper Zero, the little handheld device that you can, like, change traffic lights and shit with?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
What's funny is, as you were mentioning that, I had the thought also of the preponderance of 3D printers and the popular use of those.
Yes. An interesting use of 3D printers. Yeah. When we started talking about this in the Blood of My episode, I think I was like, maybe we should not. Maybe we should not discuss this. Yeah. There are many ways. And again, to repeat myself, it's not about every man having a rifle. It's about anyone could have a gun in their pocket. You know what I mean? It's not about, like, we're a military marching force. It's the fact that the oppressor has to be afraid. Mm-hmm. And Che actually says something similar, where he says that it's not necessary to put up a firm resistance every time, but simply to signal to the oppressor that they are in an area that has guerrilla support that is ready to fight. It's like, this is a zone that I am not guaranteed my safety in. He also mentions the psychological effect of eliminating the vanguard. I mean, hell, the IRA... I think they sniped like 8 people over 10 years or 10 people over 8 years. Okay, that's not a lot of people, right? But it's enough for sniper at work to be, a bumper sticker. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, it's the psychological effect is there. I mean, God, even kneecapping. Jesus. I'd love to learn more about the Troubles.
Same. And I'm still psyched to get into the Connolly.
Yeah, we definitely need to. Yeah, if you have any Troubles recommendations or Irish recommendations in general, let us know at leftandredfeedback@gmail.com.
I'm going to jump way forward to 145 for my penultimate quote. I just really like this. He's talking about vigilance on the part of the guerrilla. And he says, vigilance over morale within the revolutionary masses should be stricter, if this is possible, than vigilance against the non-revolutionary or the disaffected. It can never be permitted, lest the revolution take the dangerous path of opportunism, that a revolutionary of any category should be excused for grave offenses against decorum or morality simply because he is a revolutionary. This idea of holding ourselves to a higher standard of morality and decorum, I think, is valid. And I said on our Beyond Nature episode that I think it's silly for us to talk about Marxism as a non-moral science, as something separate from morality, where the idea... I think a lot of people find themselves coming to communism and Marxism, Leninism, just largely because they feel a moral tinge.
Yeah.
They're seeking something like justice, which comes from a sense of morality and empathy.
Yeah.
I like that Che is making a very clear connection. You're saying that we have to behave morally because we are revolutionaries.
Yeah. Well, I think there's an interesting question there about... 2 questions, actually, is how prefigurative does your movement need to be? And also, how prefigurative can it be? In the ideal, I suppose, it would be best to emulate the kind of structures that you want to, impose upon society.
For sure.
Right? I think that that's a natural thing to think. I guess it's just the balancing of that with not necessarily a pragmatism, but of like a productive pace, of like actual movement.
Yeah, no, I get that. I mean, that's the compromise of the state is exactly that. Like, I like the idea of a council meeting and deciding everything through like rigid debate, but also that's how you fucking get yourself killed.
Yeah. So yeah, it's just something there. I mean, there is something thinking about prefiguration, right? There is something he says about how cooperative work should be instituted as often as possible within the limits of reality, basically, because it helps to build up that skill, basically. He even says that as the guerrilla war is so prolonged, right, the administrative tasks become more and more complex, and that complexity lends itself also to the training necessary to then run society afterwards. you know? So, pretty nice. There are a couple quotes I have in A Method that I think were actually pretty interesting.
Okay.
He says, "The largest of all imperialist powers feels in its own guts the bleeding inflicted by a poor and underdeveloped country. Its fabulous economy feels the strain of the war effort. Murder is ceasing to be the most convenient business for its monopolies." Something I was thinking about a lot with, it's just like, what are the means of oppression, really, in this day and age? When we talk about inviting oppression, we're thinking about violence, right? But there is a sense in which the guerrilla struggles lended themselves to popular reforms, even without a total victory at the end. The oppressive nature of a lot of these countries had to change. In a lot of ways, they were intensified, but in a lot of ways, they did prompt reform to happen, and a lot of that ended up being political reform. When he says that monopolies can no longer resort to murder in the same way, part of me reads that as saying, like, the tactics of oppression have simply developed. You see it in a lot of places, like in Colombia with FARC, even recently with the Kurds and the PKK, they've laid down their arms, right? Because they have been offered an opportunity to, essentially be entered into a struggle which they then think will be more possible for them, which is the political struggle, right? And I just think it's something to keep in mind, is that when we're talking about repression, it's not necessarily that we're talking about murder. In the same way that part of me is thinking about those militias, right, disbanding, laying down their arms, and then joining political parties or whatever. Similarly in Venezuela, although, as I noted, I can't comment on Chavez and onwards. But even in a way where I think some of the discourse around more progressive candidates here in America, like really fucking stupid discourse, I mean, it's not stupid in its messaging, but it's stupid that it's happening, is, whether like someone like Zoran Mamdani in New York actually represents some kind of progress. I've heard some very ultra-coded people on TikTok say, he supports the same interests as Trump and that kind of thing. Obviously, I disagree in the messaging that he's putting out there. It'll have to be seen as to what is possible, but, in what ways can repression develop itself as something other than violence, right? As something other than murder? If we're talking about guerrilla warfare as simply a means to an end, and we're thinking about that means as being a struggle in one form or another, in what ways do we have to watch out for repression that isn't necessarily violent? It kind of goes back to those cultural levers of power. And then another quote that I really enjoyed, this is unrelated, but I do really recommend reading The Message to the Tricontinental Listener, because it's an interesting development to see Che's thoughts in 1960 and then 1963, which is after the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then later down the line in 67, which is right before he died. I just love that he says, "The United States had no colonies in this region, but is now struggling to penetrate its partners' fiefs." That was great. I love the paragraph below. He says, "So far, it does not have their great interest to defend, except its pretended right to intervene in every spot of the world where its monopolies detect huge profits, or the existence of large reserves of raw materials." I just thought that was so funny.
Yeah.
What
USA
interesting-
World Police.
Yeah, we've got military bases in every fucking country on this planet, except for, a handful. That seems insane. Why?
That it would ever be allowed also is just
Yeah.
wild. Yeah.
Well, I
mean, allowed. In
yeah,
air quotes,
allowed,
big
right?
Air quotes, but
Yeah, exactly. God, I don't know. Learning about any kind of modern U.S. history, you can really realize how fucking corrupt it is. I mean, obviously there's the blatant ones, but like, I read a book about the Bushes recently. I read Family of Secrets, and even in the Iraq War, like the coalition of the willing, quote unquote, nobody was willing. They had to be threatened. They had to be strong-armed. The Bush government, I think they did like serious threats to France about not necessarily like sanctions, but, like we're not going to be doing business if you're not supporting our fucking war in Iraq.
yeah, coalition of the blackmailed.
Yeah, but pretty much, So, I don't know. The U.S. is truly a fucking monster, I mean, and we've had that in mind throughout this whole project. It's just that, like, what's the head of the beast, the head of the snake? It's the United States.
Yeah, it's been a fascist project from the get.
Yeah, that's rough. All right, that was it for me.
Okay, well, moments of revolutionary optimism are few and far between for me, but I read something in this that actually did kind of speak to me and made me feel pretty good. It's brief, but I think powerful on 138. "Solidarity among peoples does not now come from religion, customs, tastes, racial affinity, or its lack. It arises from a similarity in economic and social conditions, and from a similarity in desire for progress and recuperation." And I just loved that, and I think it speaks, kind of like you said in your intro, about Che to his uniquely populist worldview of seeing us all as shared siblings in the struggle for our own liberation.
Yeah.
And there's something really beautiful in that we don't need things like religion or racial identity or whatever to connect or divide us, because ultimately we are already connected as
Right. Yeah.
peoples of the world.
God, I always think, we are more alike than we're different. Always.
For sure.
I mean, that's just the case. Workers of the world unite.
Hell yeah. So that was Guerrilla Warfare by Che Guevara.
Yeah. What questions did you have?
I don't have any unique questions that we haven't already discussed. I think the big question is obviously, like, what is the viability of guerrilla warfare in the modern world?
Yeah.
Which I think we've already discussed at length where we stand on that. What about you?
My big question was, what really is the distinction between guerrilla warfare like Foucault theory and protracted people's war?
Yeah.
I'd be interested in exploring more of that. I have a lot of questions about South America still. I have some questions just about what are the possibilities in that area. I know that there's a bit of a pink wave between whether we're talking about, I don't know, AMLO and Morales and even Lula in Brazil. I don't feel guilty supporting those people, but part of me is still thinking about, like, in what ways does that hamper revolutionary potential in the same way? There's still that question of reform in my mind. And that's just not necessarily related to guerrilla warfare, just more so to the situation in South America as a whole, which has been shaped by guerrilla warfare over the last 60 years.
Yeah.
So that's really my biggest question here.
Okay. I would recommend this book if you are interested in a recipe for a Molotov cocktail.
Yeah. I would recommend this edition specifically for a broad overview of guerrilla warfare and its effects on South America and Latin America. I probably wouldn't recommend the essay itself, Guerrilla Warfare, on its own. I don't think it would stand alone, but I would recommend reading it in context, in the context of history as well, in the context of the Cuban situation. I think it's worthwhile there, so that'd be my recommendation.
Yeah, I would agree, and we didn't spend much time dwelling on it, but I actually thought the epilogue was probably the most interesting part of the essay, because it was Che doing a little bit of reflection on what happened in Cuba.
Yeah.
And I found that really fascinating.
I would definitely, at the very least, read Guerrilla Warfare, A Method as well. I thought the message to the Tricontinental was very good also, but that was really because it was just kind of expanding on the historical context. And the case studies were pretty good. Just a nice broad overview. So, if you had questions, or if you have answers maybe, if you have other recommendations on what to read, or if you have thoughts, concerns, issues, anecdotes, you can let us know. leftandredfeedback@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you.
Absolutely.
What are we reading next? Oh, I already know the answer. We're going back to Capital.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We're going back to Capital, yeah. Listener, I'm happy to tell you, I think, bar sheer catastrophe, I think that we'll have Capital done. I don't want to say a date in particular, but we said what, like maybe 3 more times?
Yeah, we've got 3 more Capital episodes if it all goes to plan.
Yeah. So, hey, hopefully you'll join us.
Absolutely. We are intending to read chapters 15 to 22 of the most recent edition of Capital.
Yes, the Princeton translation. Seems like a lot of chapters. Really, it's not that crazy. I think it was about, 100 pages or so?
Yeah, it's less than we read last time. It's just a lot of short chapters.
Yeah, so I'm excited to polish this off. Yeah, hopefully you'll join us.
Yep, don't get left unread.
Don't get left unread, y'all. See ya.
Bye.
El Moncada nos mostró el camino a recorrer y desde aquel alto ejemplo para nosotros siempre 26.
Siempre es 26, siempre es 26, para nosotros siempre es 26.
La patria es canto y amor, la patria es lucha y deber, y en esto del patriotismo para nosotros siempre 26.
Siempre es 26, siempre es 26, para nosotros siempre es 26.
Solo el trabajo creador es la vía de crecer y en la cuestión del trabajo para nosotros siempre 26.
Siempre es 26, siempre es 26, para nosotros siempre es 26.
La ideología es motor para avanzar y vencer. Y en cuanto a la ideología, para nosotros siempre 26.
Siempre es 26, siempre es 26. Para nosotros siempre es 26.
La conciencia y el valor triunfaron sobre el ayer y desde aquel mismo instante para nosotros siempre es 26.
Siempre es 26, siempre es 26. Para nosotros siempre es 26.